I'm 12.
I'm 8.
And I'm 11 years old.
And in some parts of the world, girls my age will never learn to read.
But by listening to this episode, you've helped change that.
Because you've helped fund education for some of the world's most disadvantaged girls by supporting us here at Mamma Mia and our partners at Room to Read.
Mamma Mia is funding 100 girls in school each and every day.
So thanks for listening to this podcast
And for helping make the world a better place for women and girls.
The mother-in-law has been the heart centre of this family for perhaps 30 years that she's devoted herself to this family and maybe made sacrifices for them and developed traditions and really perhaps done her best to make them into good human beings. And then if someone else comes along that maybe is going to have contradictory ideas, that could be a little bit threatening to her, and she doesn't get a choice on this person that could potentially change her life.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to this very special episode of No Filter for Mother's Day. If you've ever been in a romantic relationship of any kind and you've been together a while, you will have probably encountered your partner's mum. The image we have of mothers-in-law is pretty grim generally. They don't get really great press. My mother-in-law, for example, sometimes she tries to bring over freshly baked cakes. Can you believe that? But seriously, for many women, your relationship with your mother-in-law can be one of the most fraught of your lives. And there are some really good reasons for this. I mean, they're intimately connected to your partner, and so are you, obviously, but to one another, you're pretty much strangers. So when I read Sally Hepworth's latest novel, The Mother-in-Law, which details the very complicated relationship between two women that ultimately ends with one of them dead, I immediately decided I wanted to interview her. Since my relationship with my own mother-in-law is pretty straightforward, cakes notwithstanding, I put a call out for more interesting mother-in-law stories, and then I grabbed some popcorn and watched them roll in. I think this was my favourite. Dear Mia, my mother-in-law is extremely difficult. I met my Australian husband online and married him prior to meeting his family. I am from North America. This was not a smart idea, as I think if I had met my in-laws before the wedding, I would have insisted he move to my country instead of me moving to Australia. Over the years, my mother-in-law has been a very high-maintenance person. She demands a daily nap during the visit. She commandeers the conversation. She also dictates the activities that happen during her visit. The one thing that has stood out over the years, though, is that when she does visit, thankfully only once a year, she steals my spare toilet rolls. First, I thought I was going nuts. I do keep spare toilet rolls under the sink in the guest bathroom, and I noticed that after she left, they were gone. Did I run out? Well, the investigation started at that point as there were no empty rolls in the bin or in any other bin that could count for the amount of rolls that were missing. Usually around 4 to 6 rolls, at least each day. I told my husband, he had no idea what was going on. The second, third, fourth visit, same thing happened. So I spoke to my sister-in-law. She married my husband's brother, but they moved to the UK. Very smart. And she noticed the same thing at her place. Toilet rolls going missing. Who flies to the UK to then smuggle toilet paper home to Australia? So I started marking them with a pencil to try and track them. I was getting mad. I found it so rude. In the end, after 15 years of this, I now hide the vast majority of the spare toilet rolls in my closet and only leave one at a time in her bathroom during her visit. My sister-in-law also does the same, and once when my mother-in-law complained about running out of toilet paper, my sister-in-law told her to go buy some. I can't get through this without laughing. We really don't understand this compulsion, and I couldn't exactly ask to check her bags when she left, so the only way I handle it is to portion out the toilet rolls. I know it sounds petty, but it was so annoying, and it's like we now have a weird little game going. She knows I know, but I can't ask. It's cheap and rude, and it is just one thing on a very long list of issues and only one story of about 1 million. Oh my God, that story is so good. Yes, that's probably why mother-in-laws have a bad reputation, because some of them steal toilet paper. Sally Hepworth doesn't steal toilet paper, but she's not a mother-in-law yet. She is, however, one of Leanne Moriarty's favourite Australian authors and one of mine. She's written 5 books, she has 3 children, and she spent a long time talking to people who had issues with their mothers-in-law. So what is it about this relationship that makes it so high drama and sometimes high farce? Here's Sally Hepworth. Sally Hepworth, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You look lovely.
You look lovely too.
I was given your latest book, The Mother-in-Law, by my kind of daughter-in-law, Jessie Stevens, who is my co-host on our podcast Mamma Mia Out Loud, but who is also goes out with my son. Now, you're only 38 and you've written 5 books. How does that timeline work?
Well, I've been doing it for about 10 years now. I guess I always wanted to write, but it wasn't something that I thought that you could do. You know, when you finish school, there's no degree that you go and start writing, or I suppose there is creative writing, but that doesn't necessarily lead you into novel writing. So I went into the world. I did a human resources degree. I then worked in event management, and then I went on maternity leave the first time. And like a classic, stupid first-time mother, I thought I was going to have all this time to work on a book. Yeah.
While the baby sleeps.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I was living in Canada at the time. They're wonderfully progressive and they pay you for a whole year of maternity leave. So wow. I thought, how good is that? I thought it's now or never. So I did write most of a book that year. I had a good sleeping first baby. My second and third were not so great.
Was it autobiographical? Because most people's first novel tends to be autobiographical.
I've heard that, and no, it wasn't. It was really, and still continues to be, I write books like the kind of books I want to read. And at that point, I was reading books like Sophie Kinsella's Shopaholic, and I hadn't discovered Leanne Moriarty yet, but that was kind of, then I fell in love with her and my books went a little bit more in that direction. So that first book was again, it was a made-up story. It hasn't been published, that one, but about a woman who spends a summer in the south of France and learns to love like the French. So that's what it was called, Love Like the French.
Now, you say it hasn't been published. You wrote the book, while the baby slept. Mm-hmm. How long did it take you, that first one?
It took me about 18 months and I was due to go back to work after 12 months, but we moved back from Canada. And so I really just took my time about finding a job after that, because hoping that, of course, that first book was going to break out and I was never going to have to work again, which, of course, didn't happen.
It's what every author secretly hopes.
Isn't
and
it?
then it's a real disappointment when it doesn't work out that way. I mean, it does for some people, but most people it doesn't, right?
It's pretty rare for it to happen with the first book. But I thought, of course, that I would be the exception. And 18 months it took me to write that book. That book did find me my agent.
How did you find an agent?
I queried every literary agent in the world, and after being rejected by most of them, some fool decided that they did like my book.
So you just cold called or cold emailed?
Emailed. So they have very specific requirements of what they're looking for, usually maybe 3 chapters or 10 pages and a synopsis of the book. And this particular agent, who is not my agent anymore, but she was looking to build her list, and so she kind of took a chance on a bit of an unknown. And then later down the track, she left. She gave my manuscript to the owner of the agency, who is now my agent and has been for 10 years. So that was what the first book did for me, which was great.
How did you know how to write a book?
Okay, I'm going to tell you the truth. I opened up my Google browser and I typed in how to write a novel. And I think this is why I hadn't done it when I was 17 and leaving school.
Because there was no Google.
Right. If I had Google is your friend. And so often I have people coming up to me and saying, can we have coffee? I want to pick your brain about how to get published. And I say, girlfriend, Google. It's there. It has everything. And that first time I looked up how to publish a book and lots of links came up and I picked one and I wrote it. I've never used that particular path again, and I don't really remember what it was, but I think it could be any particular method that you follow or don't follow a method. You just...
Well, how much is science and how much is art? Like when I imagine someone writing a novel, I kind of see them feverishly in a room typing away and all the creativity happening. How much of it is that and how much of it is there's a structure and there's a method and that there's a plan?
It's both. Of course it's both. And I do that feverish thing in a room. I think every writer does that, whether they plan or not, because there's so much creativity that happens within the structure of a novel. But for me early on, I think part of convincing myself that I could do it was really deep diving into the craft of novel writing and understanding how it works. A friend of mine said to me recently, it's a little bit like being an architect. First, you've got to make sure that the house can stand up, and then you make it beautiful.
Mothers-in-law, as my mother-in-law corrected me when I was telling her about this. She said, no, it's mothers-in-law, not mother-in-laws.
My mum I was on the Daily Edition just before, and I got off and I looked at my phone and there was a text message from my mum saying mothers-in-law. So I've obviously just said it wrong on national television.
I mean, it is fertile ground, but obviously it would seem to be quite incendiary for you to write a book about the murder of a woman's mother-in-law. How's your mother-in-law doing?
That is the first question that everyone asks me. I'm really impressed that you've held off this long. Do you know what? She's great. She was a little nervous when she found out that I was writing a book about a mother-in-law who's murdered, but she's since read the book.
She's since gone into witness protection, and I'm sure she's very happy in her new life.
No, she's great, and she's quite happy that she's got her moment in the sun, actually. And this book is nothing like, the character of Diana is nothing like my mother-in-law. And I actually was very fond of the character Diana too. So I think if anyone reads the book, they will find that what I really wanted to do with the book is show that no one is evil, and in fact everyone has an understandable perspective. So, yeah.
That's one of the things I loved about it most, as an introduction to your style, which does tend to, in your books, take different points of view. And she's not a monster. I mean, through the eyes of her daughter-in-law, in many ways she is. But what I loved was the way you also told the story and the way that you jumped back and forth in the timeline through her eyes. And it gave me such insight into all those points at which not just mother and daughter-in-law relationships, but all relationships can go wrong, where two people just misconnect. They sort of just misfire in their connection.
Yes, because no one wants to be evil, do they? No one wants to be mean. It usually comes from either a lack of skills, they're not able to communicate in the way that they want to, or they are scared of something. I think in a lot of mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationships, maybe there is some fear of perhaps losing the son or just the family changing. There are lots of reasons why people act the way that they do, and I always like to look at the complications of that, and rather than just label someone evil, and really try and understand it, because everyone has a reason to act the way they do.
It's one of the most potentially fraught areas and relationships, and I've given this a lot of thought. I too have a great relationship with my mother-in-law, but what does it come down to? Why is it such a loaded relationship?
Yeah, well, obviously I've been speaking about this a lot, and there are a lot of reasons, and those reasons are different for each mother-in-law, daughter-in-law unit. But one thing that they all have in common, of course, is that they didn't choose each other. They're thrust into this relationship, and quite an intimate relationship, a familial relationship, and they may get along. It may work out great, but it might not. And if it doesn't, there's very little recourse for them. You can't divorce your mother-in-law. I suppose you can divorce your partner if you're that desperate to get rid of her. But really, they're kind of stuck with each other, and they have to make it work. And the other thing about it, which is the reason that mother-in-laws and daughter-in-laws have this problem more than mother-in-laws and, say, son-in-laws, or son-in-laws and father-in-laws, is that these two women tend to be the heart centre of the family. The mothers, whether it's the daughter-in-law or the mother-in-law, even if they're not mothers, I think women tend to be the glue of family. And once you've got two heads, there is just naturally a little bit of a back and forth as to who's in control, who wants to be in control, what happens if we both want something different. So,
is there some aspect of competition about it, in terms of you both have really deep relationships with the same man? In very different ways. But I know that as a mother now of an adult son, it's been a process of learning to let go, step back, to make way for another woman to come into his life. in terms of my, in quote marks, daughter-in-law, I've said one of the things they don't tell you about being a parent is how wonderful it is to watch your children fall in love. Like watching my son fall in love with Jessie has been one of the great joys of my life, and seeing them together just fills my heart. But I think that's because I think she's unreal. If I didn't, I can imagine that would be really tough.
Oh, it must be tough. And I don't think it's always a case, and this is just my opinion, I'm not an expert, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I don't think that it is always a jealousy thing or a power thing. I think it can be. As I said, every relationship is different, but I think sometimes it can just be the fact that the mother-in-law has been the heart centre of this family for perhaps 30 years, that she's devoted herself to this family and maybe made sacrifices for them and developed traditions and really perhaps done her best to make them into good human beings. And then if someone else comes along that maybe is going to have contradictory ideas, that could be a little bit threatening to her, and she doesn't get a choice on this person that could potentially change her life. I mean, when you think about the influence that she could have, she could be the one who encourages or doesn't encourage her son to visit his mum in the nursing home one day. So if there is a difficult relationship there, I really can understand why the mother-in-law can find it hard. But on the flip side, as you say, if you think that your child has found the right person, what a wonderful joy and what an addition to the family.
A lot of the conflict that I've observed in people that I know and people that I don't know, we put a question in the Mum Mia Out Louders Facebook group inviting people to tell us stories about their mother-in-laws, which was just heaven to read and gave me so many laughs. But one of the themes that keeps coming up is this idea that the mother-in-law doesn't think that the partner is good enough or will take care of her son well enough. Is that something that's at the heart of some of these conflicts?
Maybe. I mean, that is something that you hear, isn't it? And maybe that is the case, that they don't think that. But I wonder if that is going back to the mother-in-law and what she sees her own value as being. You know, perhaps she has spent her whole life looking after this child, and that has been her life's work, and she's very proud of it. And so perhaps she doesn't not trust the new daughter to do it, but she feels that loss, that suddenly her life's work is being taken away from her. And I think that often it is far more to do with the mother-in-law than it is to do with the daughter-in-law. That would be my take on it.
How did you do your research?
Well, insofar as the mother-in-law stuff, it was really anecdotal, and I kind of came to the book teamed with information and stories.
Everyone want to tell you their stories?
Yes. And a couple of stories that were from my mother's group or from my friends have made it into the book. And it was kind of my way of explaining stories that I never understood. For example, in the book, and this is not a spoiler because it's not a big deal, but there is a scene where the mother-in-law brings a raw chicken to her daughter-in-law right after she's had a baby. And that was
heartbreaking.
Yes.
Funny and heartbreaking.
And this happened to a woman in this playgroup that I went to when my son was little, and it became infamous, this story about the chicken, and we were all just saying, why did she bring a chicken? Why would she bring the chicken? Is it because she hates you?
Yeah.
You know, would you bring a chicken to someone you hate?
It feels like such a passive-aggressive gift.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so this was really my imagining of why the chicken showed up. You know, I wanted to understand, and I never got a real answer, so I created an answer of why the chicken showed up. So mother-in-laws, that part of the research I felt like was done, although as I told people that I was writing a book about a mother-in-law, the stories kept coming. But there was another fun part of my research which came because I'd never written a book involving a crime before, and I had been doing a book club visit for The Mother's Promise, one of my previous books, and I was the author guest, and during the question time, someone asked if I was working on anything new, and I said, yes, I've got this idea for a book about mother-in-laws, but it involves a crime. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do it because I don't have police expertise. There were 3 female police detectives in this book group, and they said they would love to help me.
Oh, wow.
And so I spent such a lot of time with these three. They answered so many questions for me about what happens when you arrive at someone's house to tell them that there's been a death in the family, about the investigation process, about how the actual murder might happen. And that was funny because one of the detectives had to tell me that my questions had become so specific that if my mother-in-law was to be found dead, these questions were going to have to go on the record.
Wow.
Because they thought I was fishing for ways to do it.
And then what should I do?
That's right.
How would I cover that up?
So that police aspect was a really fun and different part of the research for this book, which I haven't had to do before.
Those scenes were drawn so vividly.
Good.
So in terms of the different aspects of mother-in-law behaviour, another story that I hear again and again is about the mother-in-law who has the key and lets herself into the house. So it's that over-familiarity and the lack of boundaries. And I think it's interesting because when you have young children, as you know, there are no boundaries. You know, there just are no boundaries. Emotionally, when they're young, no physical boundaries. It's just kind of... it's access all areas in many ways, being a parent, having close relationships with your children, and it goes in both directions. And then as they get older, particularly with boys, it's about pulling away. And it would seem that a lot of the miscommunication and the misunderstanding and the friction comes with those boundaries not being redrawn with your son as an adult. Mm-hmm. And it's certainly something that I'm still learning about.
Yeah. Because how do you really draw a line with your baby? And you know, my children are a little bit younger than yours, but I can still see that, you know, you feel like you've changed their nappies and you've birthed them into the world. And then I can see that. I have great empathy for the mother-in-law.
And I think the other aspect of it is everyone really understands their own mother and their relationship with their mother and all the complexities of it and the imperfections and the eccentricities. But then meeting someone else's mother, it is like being dropped into the middle of a relationship you've got no history with and you don't understand what the rules are. So, for example, they might use guilt or they might use inappropriate language, or there was one woman who just told us that every time her mother-in-law comes over, she steals their toilet paper. That was my favourite.
Wow.
And in most cases, the friction then comes with the partner wanting the husband to not choose but to draw boundaries.
Yeah.
So if the mother can't draw boundaries, the son needs to draw boundaries effectively.
Yeah, and he does. There's a great analogy of families being like campfires. And when you are born into a family, you and your mum and dad and any siblings, you sit around that campfire, you all tend the campfire, you keep it burning. But when one of the children gets married, they stay in that circle, but they spin on their little stone and they start a new campfire with their new husband-wife partner. And then they need to keep facing that campfire. That campfire is their priority. They'll always be part of their original family. But if they turn their back and they face that old campfire, what's going to happen to their new campfire? It's going to burn out. And when this works well, you can have this whole wall of campfires all burning really well as long as everyone's facing the right direction. And I think this is really powerful, isn't it? And
so interesting. So when the mother says, no, you face back my way, buddy.
Yep.
You know, stop being over there. You're part of this campfire. When in actual fact, you have to let him spin around.
Mm-hmm. And part of our role as mothers is to teach them that you need to face your new campfire. That's what we're preparing them for.
A time in your life where your relationship will often really change, either for better or worse, with your mother-in-law is when you have your own children. Mm-hmm. How, in your sort of research, how have you found that to play out?
Well, it can be a really nice time for people with their mother-in-laws if it works out well. And there are what we call mother-in-law unicorns, which are the mother-in-laws who are wonderful and they have respect the boundaries and they, you know, want to help out and they know that when it comes to your husband and your children, you know best, you know, they're wonderful. But obviously, as we know, there are a lot of people who have trouble with this and grandmothers who are desperate to get their hands on that baby and who have wisdom perhaps that they want to impart. And I've seen this go both ways, where I know my own mum really was determined not to be a overbearing mother-in-law. To her, that was the worst thing she could possibly be. And she is not that person. But I know that from my sister-in-law, she was saying to me, she can be more overbearing. I'd actually like her to come on in and help out more. She can just come in and pick up the baby. And so often in this relationship, because people aren't speaking to each other directly, they're both well-meaning. Everyone wants the same things. They all want to help. They want this relationship to work. And isn't that the case with mother-in-laws so often? Two women working really hard to make it work, but just not always getting it right.
Did you discover any best practice, either for mother-in-laws or for daughter-in-laws?
Well, yes, we talked a little bit about 3 things, but in fact this can be applied to any relationship. And the first one is empathy. You always have to look at both sides of the relationship. In any relationship, if you do that, you're bound to be in a more harmonious state. The second one is compromise. Once you become an adult, you know that you don't always get to have your own way, but perhaps you can meet in the middle. And the final one is gratitude. And this is a hard one because I think if you are struggling with your mother-in-law or your daughter-in-law, it's hard to feel grateful, but you can still step back and think, this person is really important to our family. They may be a wonderful grandmother. They've been a wonderful mother, and look at what they actually bring to the family.
3 great rules for every relationship, as you say.
Aren't they? Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of No Filter. You can buy Sally's book, The Mother-in-Law, at any good bookstore. Please try to support a ladies' startup or an independent bookstore if you can, and maybe buy a copy for your own mother-in-law. What could possibly go wrong with that as a gift? No Filter is produced by Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, and if you're looking for another episode to listen to next, I would suggest you listen to our podcast called Before the Bump. And I really shouldn't be interested in this podcast because it's about the part where you're trying to get pregnant. It's about what to do around fertility, how to get pregnant, all of those kinds of things. And I'm past that time. I've got 3 kids and I'm done with that. But there's something about Rachel Corbett and Zoe Marshall, the chemistry that they have. I found myself driving along laughing out loud. They talk to an expert who sounds disconcertingly like Julie Bishop if she was an obstetrician and a fertility expert. And it's just a great listen. And if you know someone who is thinking about getting pregnant, maybe someone in their 20s who doesn't know nearly enough about their own fertility and their own cycle, recommend it to them.